Welcome to the Grampians Wine podcast. I'm your host, Neil Butler. In each episode of the podcast, we speak to a representative of the Grampians winemakers or one of the wineries in the region. We'll learn about the wines, the wineries, and of course, the personalities associated with one of Victoria's leading wine regions. Today, I'm pleased to introduce a special guest, Viv Thomson from Best Wines and the man affectionately known as the grandfather of the Grampians wine region. Welcome, Viv.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much.
Great to have you on board. Really thrilled to be talking to a man who knows so much about the wine region and has been such an important part of it. Let's go back to not your start, even further back than that. When were the first vines planted in the Grampians region?
It's a bit hard to say. I think it depends. And of course, the Grampians region is actually relatively new as a delineated area. But not far from here, a place called Doctors Creek. There's a Charles Metzger. He planted vines over there. It's, I think, probably going back to the 1840s, 1850s. There were Tret and Blancpain, who planted grapes actually in Great Western in the 1850s, and they were very influential people. French and quite fascinating people who did a lot to promote the area at the time. So that's probably the earliest ones that I know of.
And it seems to me, I have been to France once myself, and it seems a very, very long way away from Great Western. I wonder what it was that brought them to Great Western to plant grapes.
Well, they came here following gold. It was a part of the gold rush. And of course, these people came from all over the world. There were English, there were Dutch, there were the Chinese came, the Irish came, Americans came. They all came following the gold. And in the case of Tret and Blancpain, and perhaps I'll talk about them first because they're quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
That Henry Blancpain, he had experience with grape growing. He came from the Swiss-French border, and was drafted into the army, which I guess at that stage, we're talking now probably about the 1840s, was a probably short-term existence. So he decided to decamp and went to Uruguay in South America. And you think, well, why the hell did you go to Uruguay? Well, that's a good question. And then after that, of course, he went to South Australia. And if you're cheeky enough, you'd say, well, why would you go to South Australia? Sorry. Apologise for myself.
Hello to all the South Australian listeners. Thank you. Yeah.
He then went across to Beechworth, where he met his wife-to-be, Marie Truette. She came from the north of France, came off a farm there, and she ran away from home when I think she was probably about between 15 and 20, probably about 18, I think. And her young brother, he was about 14 or 15, went with her, and they ran away from home. I'm not too sure how they organised their finances, but they made their way to the coast where they got a boat to Australia. Now, just think about this. These two young people, they'd probably never seen the sea before, but they'd heard about gold. I mean, there's no internet, there's no television, nothing like that, but they'd heard about the gold, pick up gold in Australia. And they want to come and pick up gold in Australia. So they came to Australia up at Beechworth. And that's where they met up with Henri Blancpain. And they followed the gold down and came to Great Western. At that stage, the gold was running out at Great Western. So they decided to settle down, and I think they planted vegetables and fruit trees to feed the miners. And of course, part of it was also grapevines. And they were certainly the first people to make sparkling wine in Victoria. I'm not sure they weren't the first people to make sparkling wine in Australia. But they were very influential in the early days. And I think they planted vines probably the early 1850s.
So that obviously became, we've obviously come a long way in that time. How did that start to morph into becoming more what we now associate with Great Western? Was there a growth immediately, or did it take a while for that to happen?
Look, I'm not sure. I wasn't around then, although sometimes people might look like me. But certainly, I believe at the turn of the century, this is the late 1800s, I think there are 114 grape growers and winemakers in this area. Now, I'm talking Great Western, Rhymney, Ararat, Stawell, which is quite a lot. So obviously the industry had a big burst in the late 1800s. I mean, here, for example, the best came out and out to Australia. They came out to Australia in 1830. Arrived in Hobart. Arrived in Hobart, and their ship arrived there. They were heading for Launceston. So one of the brothers decided to walk up to Launceston because they wanted to organise accommodation. Now, it's not a hell of a long way, but I mean, there weren't too many flights. The flights were all cancelled, of course.
Absolutely.
And there was no COVID then either. But he walked up and back, organised accommodation, got back to Hobart, and then when the ship would have been refitted from the trip from the UK, they moved up to Launceston. From Launceston, are there a number of years, and one of their main complaints was the cheap imports coming in from England. Now, they were cabinet makers, so they were a bit concerned about these cheap imports, which isn't the problem we have today, not in that regard. David Best then moved across. I think he was in Launceston about 2 or 3 years, and then he moved across to Port Phillip. And at that stage, I think at the age of 54, his wife had their 8th child.
Wow.
So that's, so ladies, have a think about that. But he set up a cabinet maker in, I think where is it? Not Little Burke Street. I mean, Little Collins Street. No, it might have been Little Burke Street, I think. Yep. He set up premises there. And they also, at that stage, had 15 acres around Hawthorn, which I gather is around about where the Hawthorn Town Hall is today. So that'd be a bit of prime real estate today, wouldn't it,
15 square metres would be. It has to think for 15 acres.
The boys were growing up, and of course, the gold fever started to get into everybody's veins. So the two boys said let's come on, we'll clear out and go and find some gold. Well, they went looking for gold, but they reckon that was a bit of a mug's game. So eventually they ended up at Great Western. In the meantime, their sister had married a grazier in the Western District by the name of Whitehead, and he ran cattle. So they worked for him for a while and learned about cattle, how to raise cattle, how to slaughter cattle. So they moved up to Great Western, and while they were at Great Western, they learnt their trade, and they set up a butchery at Great Western with the idea of feeding the miners. And when that ran out, they saw what Truett and Blomfield were doing, and they were going quite successfully. This is, I guess, must have been about the 1860s. Anyway, they took up land. Joseph took up land where Seppelts are today, and Henry took up land where we are today. I think Joseph took up land he couldn't have taken land took up land in 1865, because the Land Act had been pronounced, and they could, at that stage, from then on, take up land. Henry came down here to Vests, where we are today, and he took up the land in 86, which he could do pretty much straight away. Now, the interesting thing is about here is that he planted vines. He took up land in 1866 and planted vines in 1868. Now, if you've been to this area, there's some pretty big timber around here. Some of it's regrowth timber, but there's no way in the world they could have taken up land in 66 and planted vines in 68. Because, I mean, you've got to clear the land, you had to dig out the stumps, and there weren't any front-end loaders or bulldozers in those days. They had horses, carts and drays. And so I suspect they were actually working there at least 10 years before that.
Wow.
Must have been, in order to prepare the land. So bearing in mind they couldn't take up the land until 65. So virtually soon after that, they took up, Joseph took up land up there. And quite interesting, the land that Joseph took up, it's quite near Great Western. And a few years later, they put the railway line through. And he was most upset because the railway line cut his vineyard in half. Which in years in the future, of course, they had a siding there so he could load his wine onto the train and away it went. So it wasn't so bad. But in those days, he was pretty upset because they cut his vineyard in half with the railway line. But the first vines, they weren't the first vines in this area, but they were certainly, it would have been very early on. And this also brings in the discussion on phylloxera, because obviously at that stage, the area was booming. And there's a lot of grapes being planted all over the place. Now, I think the best vineyards virtually got on board before the boom, because I'd say that Bests had mainly finished their planting before phylloxera got going, and therefore there was no need to bring in vine sources from other regions.
Yeah.
And therefore we had no phylloxera in this region.
Okay.
Unlike Yarra Valley and Rutherglen and these places.
Yeah. So those two vineyards that you talk of, where you are now as Best's Wines, and also we have Seppelt's up the road, they're still going. Those businesses are still continuing this, 150 years later?
Yes. Yeah, we had our 150 a couple of years ago, which was one of those things you don't think much about.
Yeah.
150 years is a long time.
Yeah.
But when you live here and you're with it all the time goes past, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, so forth and so on. And it just becomes part of your life. You don't think about it. And then suddenly he says, "Oh, you're 100 years old." And, oh, hell, are we? Yeah, that's pretty good. And then you're 150 years old. Oh, that's pretty good. But it's not till it doesn't strike you for quite some time that we run premises now, which was started over 150 years ago, and a lot of it here. A lot of the old barrels are here. A lot of the old buildings are here, and it's pretty special. It's pretty special.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so those two. Effectively sparking the start, if you will, of the Grampians wine region as we know it now. You obviously weren't around in those days, but you've seen a lot of places come and go. When did you sort of see that this was actually going to become a region that people would come to? Has that happened in the last 20 years, or is it 50 years? How long ago did the Grampians wine region itself become established as a special region?
Well, probably when you think, I think it all started with the resurgence of wine consumption in Australia. I'll just go back a little bit further. Yeah. As I mentioned before, at the turn of the century, I believe there's over 100, around about 114 vineyards and wineries which were here and running at that time. By 1960, there were two
wow.
left, ourselves and Seppelt's.
Yeah.
At 1960, there were 16 in Victoria.
Okay.
And you can just about, there's a group around Rutherglen, there are Tabilk, people like called Darvineses, who are I don't think long in existence. That was in 1960. So what I'm saying is that from a huge development in grape growing in the late 1900s, late 1800s, virtually the industry died with the depression in the 1930s.
Okay, yep.
Middle 20s, 30s, and I mean around this area, all those vineyards went. I think by early 1940s, I think there was only one other left. That was Poles out at Rimney, but virtually there's nobody left. And then 1960, suddenly people discovered wine. It was quite amazing. You've got to remember before 1960, if you drank wine, you had a problem.
Yeah.
Now, you, Neil, and me, I think we probably both still got that problem, but that's okay.
Yeah, but ours is an acquired problem.
Oh, yes, yours is yours. But anyway, from that point onwards, suddenly, I know around this area here, who was the third? I can't think of the third people. I think it was probably McCracken's out of Horseback. They started. McRae's and Ararat started. Lange, they didn't get started until the 70s. But there's a big upsurge in interest in the 60s. And suddenly it was just going like this. It was unbelievable. I mean, everybody drank red wine. That's all they didn't want white. Nobody they hadn't invented red wine at that stage. White wine. But by the end of the 60s, people, I mean, there were a lot of demonstrators. Probably I'm one of them. When looking at you, you're probably one of them too, or not too right. Anyway, people got suddenly we're drinking red wine. Middle of summer, drinking out of water bags, out of pannikins, out of beakers, out of anybody thing you drink. We're drinking red wine, hot red wine in the middle of summer. Give us a break. And then white ones started saying, well, this is pretty dumb. We should be drinking cold white wine. So by the end of the 60s, early 70s, bang, Riesling went off like a rocket, Reds, well, we don't want to drink any red. I had Trevor Martin, our first winemaker. He came in, he joined me in 1975. And one of Trevor's first jobs, we had a vineyard at Lake Bogue, was to make white wine out of Shiraz. Because we had all this bloody Shiraz, didn't know what the hell to do with them. So we made white wine out of it. And I shouldn't say, but in those days we sold a Chablis. I mean, all later was different in those days. But anyway, but certainly that's a massive surge. Now, the interesting thing was it took a while for the food to catch up. Nowadays, I mean, wine and food is very much a together thing. It's what we do. It's part of life. In those days, you had the wine on its own, and to hell with the food. But by I suppose, Jimmy Watson was one of the blokes who pioneered wine food in Victoria. And the Watsons, we owe them a lot as vineyards, because they supported small people like ourselves a lot, and they're wonderful people, and still are. Still on the place. But certainly I was scarce by the end of the 70s, early. I mean, how many licensed restaurants were in Melbourne in 1960?
I've got to honestly say, Viv, I don't know. I wasn't born.
No, well, I mean, there were probably
very few compared with now, I suspect.
I'm going to say half a dozen. There's probably more than that. But what I'm saying is, the idea of wine food just was, I don't say foreign, but it took people like the Watsons to start the introductory process. And I guess it wasn't until the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s that food really came into its own. And I believe we had some of the great cuisines in Australia, in the world, right here in our country. And wine and food are all part of it. And it's a change in lifestyle. And I think the wonderful thing to me is, in my time, I've seen the acceptance of wine. I mean, as before the 1960, if you drank wine, you had a problem. Post 60, that the whole turnaround, the shift in dimensions, and to me, this is the wonderful thing about the part of my industry is that I now see my industry as being acceptable. It's popular. It's a part of life. And I mean, what more could you ask?
Absolutely. And of course, the growth of the number of small wineries, not just in your region, but all across Australia, it must be a much more accessible industry these days than what it was, let's say, 50 years ago.
Yes, it's certainly more accessible, but that's dollars and cents. But just something that might be of interest. We had no tax on wine at all. I'm not too sure when sales tax was introduced, but there used to be a license fee which was applicable to licensed retailers and liquor shops, but all vineyards, there was no tax on wine at all. Okay. And then they brought in what they call the wine tax, and but in the early days. So from that point of view, it was a lot easier. But I think what happened was, when things become popular, it's a bit like merino sheep with wool, cattle with beef, almonds. Almond people are buying up the dairy farms, because the dairy farms can't make a quid, but the almond farmers are taking up there and using all the water. So as things become popular, then people buy into them, and this will certainly happen. I mean, every solicitor and doctor and in Victoria just got into the. James Halliday was a solicitor. I think he got into the wine business, and thank God he did. So as things become popular, people are coming in. There's always openings there.
And the government generally whacks a tax on it as well. Now, Viv, before we wind up, we do this for everybody that we interview, and so we get some fast facts about you as well, not just about the region. So, are you ready to kick off with those?
Yeah, we haven't had much about the region. I might be talking about myself so far.
Okay, no, it's all about it's about you. It's about the region. It's about the history. It's all good. How long have you lived and worked in the Grampians?
We have two vineyards, two wineries. One was at Lake Bogan near Swan Hill,
Mm-hmm.
and I was born up there in 1938. Came down here. My father and uncle swapped wineries, and my father came down here in 1944. So I arrived here in 44.
Okay. And what was your first role in the industry? I suspect being part of the family, you would have had a bit of work to do along the way.
Yeah, well, you're always involved in certain ways. The point was, when I was growing up, you've got to remember that wine wasn't a very popular industry.
Mm.
And there's nothing glamour about the wine industry when I first came into it, or first started to do some work around the place. And I did agriculture. I went to Roseworthy College of Agriculture for 3 years.
Okay.
And then I came home for a year, saved my money, and then went travelling for 2 years. Travelled mainly to first East Africa and then England and Europe. I was away for 2 years and came home. I met a lovely lady who looked pretty bloody expensive, so I thought I'd better get myself a decent job. So I've been at home ever since with the same lady, I might add. So,
so much.
So that was, and I guess I came home in about 1960, 61. I'd done a few vintages before that.
Mm.
Then I obviously came in supporting my father. He was getting older, and what happened was we had two wineries run by my father, my uncle, Bill, and as they got older, the mantle was passed down to me, and it got pretty tough trying to run two wineries, two vineyards, selling the whole mantle. My wife helped a lot with the marketing side of things. And then we had 4 children along the way, which that took time as well. So I guess for me, the 60s and 70s were a pretty busy time. And that's why in mid-70s, I found I just couldn't keep up. So we employed a winemaker in Trevor Mast, who was with me for the next 12 years.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, here's the crunch question. If you're going on a road trip and you can only take one case of wine, what do you take with you?
I like Pinot. As I get older, I like to drink a lot. I don't like to sip and think about it. I'm in a little store now, Pinot Meunier, which is a variety we grow here. A chap came to our cellar one day and said he had a bottle of your Pinot last night. And when I looked around, it was gone. Well, surely that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
No, if I was on a trip and I'd take a bottle. I'd take a dozen of our Pinot Meunier.
Okay, so you've got one of the bottles out, and you're about to sit down for a meal. What's that meal look like to have with that bottle of wine?
Well, it probably depends who cooked it.
Okay.
If my wife cooked it, be pretty good. I can think of 100 other people who do a hell of a good job. Me, it'd be pretty rough, I can tell you. But really, the wonderful thing about our Meunier and Pinots in general is that they're great drinking wines. I believe there are two sorts of wine. There's talking wines and drinking wines. There's the wines you talk about. Oh, this is that. But the wine's over here and the food's, God knows where the food is. But then you're drinking wines. The wine, you sit down, you enjoy your mood, you enjoy the company, and you enjoy the food. And that's always been my philosophy.
So where would you like to take that meal and that bottle? Where, if you could sit down and have that meal and that drink anywhere that you've been or haven't been yet, where would you take it? You
didn't warn me about that question, did you?
I think I did, but anyway, okay.
We've had a bit of a short discussion beforehand. All these things are coming out of the bloody woodwork now.
That's it. Absolutely. Keep you on your toes.
Oh, I don't know. I've travelled around the world quite a lot. But Australia's a wonderful country. There's a lot in this country, and we're very fortunate. My wife and I, we've done a lot of outback travel in the last, not the recent years, but for about 10 years, we went to the outback every year for a couple of months. And there's a lot of wonderful places. Oh, look, I don't know, but this area around here is a fairly attractive area. We look out this way to the Grampians. And we have a Black Range in between, and that's a pretty, I think, if I'd want to have that meal anywhere, I'd probably go out to Rimney Vineyard, which is a relatively new vineyard. It was planted in, I think, was it 69 we planted that. No, it can't be 89, but yeah, 69. Anyway, but out you've got a magical view of the Grampians. I reckon that's where we've got a big dam in front of it. So that's where I think I'd go out there, where I've got the Grampians, my home, which is my region, and a beautiful backdrop at the same time.
Well, the only thing missing then, of course, is the music. What sort of music are you going to put on the turntable, Viv?
I'm a bit of a jazz man, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Who's the pianist? I think can't think of his name now. I know we went to a wine and food show. It went to a winemakers exhibition in Sydney a few years ago, and we went to it. It was held in King's Cross, and we went down to a place after around midnight, and there was in the audience, there was a bloke there playing the piano who was quite good. I can't think of it. It might come of it. I was Roy Moorfield was with me, and Roy said to me, "Oh, that's so and so over there." He said, "He's a oh my God, I can't think of his name." Anyway, he said, "I'll go and see if he'll play for us." He went over, and this fellow got up to, "I'll play for you." And the previous musician was very, very good. This fellow, the piano, just spoke to you. It was amazing, amazing. What's his name?
I'm going to say Paul Grabowski. Am I right?
No, it wasn't him. No.
No, well, I'm going to pull out then because I don't know a lot about jazz pianists. He's the only one I know. If you were sitting down to have that meal with that music, piano-based jazz, who are the 3 people, living or dead, that you'd want to have sharing that meal with you?
That's a hard question. It's a hard question. I mean, I'd have to have my wife with me.
Mm-hmm.
We've been married now for very close to 60 years. And I mean, I won't include my family. I'd like to have them too. But I think we're looking for something a bit outside. I think Trevor Master, I'd like to have him with me. He's my first winemaker.
Yep.
And we did a lot together. Where do we go from there? I guess that there are some wonderful people I've met in the industry, and this is the wonderful thing about the life I've had is the people I've met. I mean, you meet the fellows who have helped and developed the Victorian industry a lot, like Roy Moorfield. You got fellows like Alan Watson. You got characters in the life like people like Peter Lehman. Great characters of the industry. Most like Bruce Tyrrell. These people make up the industry. They're just.
We can't limit it to 3. We might need to get a whole venue.
I'm in strife with that last one. All right.
Well, Viv, it has been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. We've gone about twice as long as we normally do because it's just been such an interesting chat. And I'm sure every person who's listened to it have enjoyed it immensely. Thanks for joining us on the Grampians Wine podcast today.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. And the only thing I haven't said is what a great region we're in. With great wine right here and what great people live in the region. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Viv. This has been another episode of the Grampians Wine podcast featuring Viv Thomson from Best's Wines. You can subscribe to the podcast by visiting grampianswinepodcast.com.au. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe, but it will give you the chance to listen to previous episodes and to be reminded whenever we publish another episode. You can watch video versions of the podcast by subscribing to the Grampians Wine YouTube channel. We'll be back soon with another episode. My name is Neil Butler. I look forward to your company then. Cheers.